Today what we are going to be discussing is how to solve a quadratic equation. So here we have a quadratic equation, 3x squared is equal to 2x minus 6. Now there are going to be two different ways to solve this that I'm going to show you. The first way is going to be to complete the square, and the second way is sort of a shortcut to completing the square called using the quadratic formula. I want to go ahead and go over completing the square first. Your first step is going to be to get this equation into standard form. Standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c, and then equaling this to 0 or to y. In this case, we're going to equal it to 0 because we're trying to solve it. So the way I do that is just by moving things over by like adding 6 here, subtracting that 12x here, and what I end up with is 3x squared minus 12x plus 6 equal to 0. You always want to go ahead and put it in descending order of degrees. So that's x to the second power, x to the first power, x to the 0 power. Basically make sure that it is in standard form in the correct order. Now, the first step, like I mentioned before, is going to be to, or the first method I'm going to use is completing the square. When you're talking about completing the square, you're going to want to use your formula, b divided by 2 squared. And your first step, always when you're completing the square, is to make sure that your a is equal to 1. In this case, it's not equal to 1 just yet. It's actually equal to 3. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and divide both sides by 3. The reason I divided by 3 is just because that's what my a is. So I'm going to divide my whole equation by whatever my a is. Sometimes it'll give me a fraction, sometimes it'll work out nicely and it will actually just give me whole numbers. In this case, it gives me whole numbers, which makes it easier to work with. But if they were fractions, you would just solve it the exact same way and wait till the very end to go ahead and simplify your fractions. Let's begin. 3 divided by 3 gives us 1, which is exactly what we wanted. So our equation right now is x squared. Negative 12 divided by 3 gives me minus 4x. And 6 divided by 3 gives me 2. And all this 0 divided by 3, it's still 0. Now that I have my equation in this form, I can go ahead and complete the square. Now the way I complete the square is I actually have to get rid of this 2. So I'm going to go ahead and move it over to the other side. X squared minus 4x is equal to negative 2. The reason I got rid of this 2 is because I want to turn this into a perfect square. It's not a perfect square at the moment, right? What I mean by that is when I look for a number that multiplies to positive 2 and adds up to negative 4, they are not going. Either I can't find that number or those numbers aren't perfect squares at the moment. So I'm looking for a number that adds up to negative 4 but multiplies to positive 2. And we actually don't have a number that does that right off the bat. So we can't factor this out. If we complete the square, we should be able to factor it out. So the formula for completing the square is going to be, we're going to take our b, we're going to divide it by 2, and then we're going to square it. So our b is negative 4. Negative 4, we're going to divide that by 2, and then we're going to square it, which gives me negative 2 squared, which actually just gives me positive 4. Now, this negative 2 we're going to use in a bit, so make sure that you remember what number you got here before you squared it. We're going to add this 4 to both sides. And what I'm left with is x squared minus 4x plus 4 is equal to positive 2. Now, I'm going to ask myself, okay, now what number can multiply to positive 4 but add up to a negative 4? And that number is this number that we got over here. I'm going to use that number to go ahead and convert this into x minus 2 times x minus 2 is equal to positive 2. The reason I did this is because if I were to FOIL this out, it would give me this. I basically factored it out. Now that I have my equation factored out, well, since it's being multiplied by itself, I can actually combine this into x minus 2 squared is equal to positive 2. And here I can actually go ahead and start solving for x by taking the square root of both sides. Remember, when I take a square root, I always have to have both the positive and the negative version of my answer. So x minus 2 is equal to plus or minus square root of 2. And my next step will be to add 2 to both sides. And so my answer will be x is equal to 2 plus or minus the square root of 2. I have two different answers. So if you want to see them both written out, you have x is equal to 2 plus the square root of 2, and x is equal to 2 minus the square root of 2. Both of these are acceptable answers for me. So let's say that you know the quadratic formula and that you wanted to use the quadratic formula instead of completing the square, instead of going through all these steps. Well, you could definitely go ahead and use your quadratic formula instead. First step is going to be to make sure that you know your quadratic formula. So we're going to write it out just to be sure. The quadratic formula is negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all divided by 2 times a. Now we're actually going to not simplify. We're going to use our original equation just to see how this works out. We have our a is equal to 3, our b is equal to negative 12, and our c is equal to 6. I'm going to go ahead and plug in my values for my variables, and I get negative 12 plus or minus the square root of negative 12 squared minus 4 times 3 times 6, all divided by 2 times 3. Now this here, ladies and gentlemen, is going to turn into positive 12 plus or minus the square root of 144 minus 12 times 6 will give us 72, all divided by 6. Now our next step is going to be to go ahead and subtract these two. So if you have a calculator handy, you can do it, or if you want, you can do it by hand. 144 minus 72, and you end up with this: 12 plus or minus the square root of 72, and you're going to go ahead and divide this whole thing by 6. Now this takes a little bit of simplifying because we didn't factor out, or we didn't divide by 3 on both sides at the beginning, but it's definitely doable. In this case, I'm going to actually separate my two fractions. I'm going to do 12 divided by 6 plus or minus the square root of 72 divided by 6. So here what I get is obviously 2. 12 divided by 6 is just 2. And here I'm going to go ahead and need to simplify this square root. 72, the square root of 72 can actually be simplified into 36 times 2. So I'm going to take the square root of 36 times 2. And what's the square root of 36? We all know that's 6. So this is 6 times the square root of 2. So we can simplify this as 6 times the square root of 2 divided by 6. And the 6's will cancel out. So what I'm left with is 2 plus or minus the square root of 2, which is actually the same answer that we got back here. So there you go, ladies and gentlemen, completing the square using the quadratic formula. Either way will work. Make sure that you let me know if you have any questions.